From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew.
Tonight, putting pressure on Russia for a deal.
I didn't like last night. I wasn't happy with it. And we're in the midst of talking peace, and missiles were fired, putting a lot of pressure. You don't know what pressure I'm putting on Russia. They're dealing. You have no idea what pressure I'm putting on Russia. We're putting a lot of pressure.
The president now telling Vladimir Putin to, quote, stop after the deadliest attack on Kyiv since last summer, saying he was, quote, not happy with the Russian leader after Moscow lobbed 70 missiles and over 100 drones toward Ukraine. Our new reporting tonight on the administration's demand Putin accept Ukraine's right to military force and the concessions it wants from Moscow. We'll speak with former U.S. ambassador to NATO Kurt Volker on what's next in the push for a peace deal.
Plus, Trump's war of words with China.
Well, they had a meeting this morning, so I can't tell you. It doesn't matter who they is. We may reveal it later.
The president teasing tariff negotiations with China while slamming the country for rejecting Boeing planes over its tit-for-tat trade war, accusing the country of killing hundreds of thousands of Americans due to fentanyl. We'll have more on that and on the president's sit-down with Norway's prime minister with Bloomberg's Natalia Drozdiak.
And a draft Trump budget proposal recommends getting rid of the Economic Development Administration, which supports economically struggling communities in rural and manufacturing areas of the country. We'll speak with Mississippi Governor Tate Reeves on how local communities are faring amid funding cuts and tariff hikes coming up.
All of that plus details from Intl and Alphabet's quarterly earnings just out a short time ago, and much more ahead this hour on Balance of Power. We begin tonight, though, with a torrent of news coming from the White House today, from tariffs and trade to the war in Ukraine and a lot more as the president met with Norway's prime minister. We're joined now for more by Bloomberg's Natalia Drozdiak to talk about it all. Natalia, it's great to have you. Bloomberg reporting today on concessions for Russia, which we really haven't heard much about until now. It's been something that really has favored Russia with the idea of a framework for peace. Now the White House calling for Russia to allow Ukraine to have a standing army. That's said to be a non-starter in Moscow, is it?
Yeah, look, this matters because Ukraine needs to be able to defend itself once there is a ceasefire deal. They want to avoid having Russia attack again. And the Europeans and the Americans both see the Ukrainians taking the lead when it comes to any sort of security guarantees. So they need to have a strong army. But as you say, Putin's demand all along has been for Ukraine's army to be largely demilitarized. So if they agree to this, that would be a major concession.
Well, of course, there are certain things that Ukraine is unwilling to agree to just as much as Vladimir Putin may be unwilling, including recognizing Crimea, which Russia illegally annexed in 2014, as Russian. President Trump contends that that is not something the U.S. is actually asking of the Ukrainians, but our reporting suggests otherwise.
Well, I think what Trump was saying was actually what they seem to be demanding or suggesting or proposing is that the U.S. recognize Crimea as part of Russian control. They're not asking for Ukraine to recognize that it fall under Russian control. And so that's the distinction he's trying to make. That might be, hard to sell to the broader audience, but that's what they're pursuing. And I think the question there is, what ramifications does that have in terms of possibly setting a precedent, if for other bad actors to potentially take land by force and then eventually have that recognized by the most powerful nation in the world. And then I would just lastly say on that the Trump administration in its first term, officials had been very clear and very strong about Russia seizing or trying to seize Crimean land there. So this would be a reversal politically for them.
Yeah, Vladimir Zelenskiy himself reposting some of those statements that came from the first Trump White House. Bloomberg's Natalia Drozdiak, thank you so much for joining us. And we want to take a closer look now at the situation with the war in Ukraine and the Norwegian Prime Minister's visit to the White House today, following President Trump's tougher rhetoric, at least when it comes to Vladimir Putin. So we turn now to Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO. He is also the former U.S. special representative for Ukraine negotiations during the first Trump administration. Ambassador, welcome back to Balance of Power. When we consider the asks we understand the U.S. is making here of both sides, knowing the contention of the White House is everyone has to walk away from the deal-making table a little unhappy, are we going beyond unhappiness, asking of both Russia and Ukraine things to which they would never consent?
Well, I think we have to put this in the right framework, which is Russia has conducted a war of aggression against Ukraine. So Russia shouldn't have the expectation that it has a right to invade, that it has a right to Ukraine's territory, that it has a right to decide whether Ukraine has a military or not. These are things that we should not be conceding that are any of Russia's business. So to say that it's a concession on the part of Russia not to take over all of Ukraine, or it's a concession on Russia's part to agree that, okay, Ukraine can have a military, these are not real concessions. On the other hand, what we're asking of Ukraine is to accept that Russia will occupy a large part of Ukrainian territory indefinitely. Now, maybe not recognized by Ukraine as legally Russian territory, but de facto, that actually is a big concession on Ukraine's part, one that they're prepared to make, and they've said so. President Zelenskiy says this several times. But it is a big deal for Ukraine to accept Russian occupation of part of its territory. It is not even reasonable for Russia to be making demands such as demilitarizing Ukraine.
Well, the president of Ukraine, Zelenskiy, shared a link last evening to Kayleigh's point earlier made by the first Trump administration that you know a little bit about, Ambassador, recognizing the sovereignty here of Crimea. In this 2018 declaration, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo called Crimea a territory seized by force in contravention of international law. What did Donald Trump think about that at the time?
He approved it. This is something that was worked on inside the Trump administration in 2018. We modeled it on the Wells Declaration of 1940, which talked about the non-recognition of the Soviet Union's occupation of the Baltic states. And so we wanted to say the same thing about Crimea. No one was fighting to retake Crimea militarily at the time. It was simply a statement that we're not going to recognize this as legally part of Russia. So this is a major change from President Trump to suggest that we would do that.
Well, as we consider the president's past statements, I want to go not as far back in history and consider, Ambassador, what he said on the campaign trail about ending the war in Ukraine and then what he said earlier today. Let's listen.
If I were president, I'd be able to negotiate an end to this horrible and rapidly escalating war within 24 hours. I have my own deadline. And we want it to be fast. And after that, we're going to have a very much different attitude.
Clearly, Ambassador, this has taken well over 24 hours, and it is no sign of ending yet. When you consider what the president's deadline may be, with suggestions from the Vice President J.D. Vance as well as Secretary of State Marco Rubio that the U.S. could be getting close to the point where it walks away from this, what is your expectation?
Well, first off, to end the war requires convincing Vladimir Putin that the costs of continuing the war are too high for him. He's the one who started the war. He's the one who prosecutes this war. And he continues to do so, as we saw attacks on Kyiv last night with several people killed in Kyiv. So it's getting Putin to decide it's too costly. We have not taken the steps needed to convince him of that. In fact, I think he is now more comfortable with continuing the war than he was on day one when President Trump took office and put out a very tough tweet on that day. So that has not happened. As for walking away, we don't really know what the Trump administration means by that right now. If it is just giving up efforts to negotiate, but everything else remains the same. So we have tough sanctions in place on Russia. Maybe those even escalate. We have armed support for Ukraine. They can pay for it themselves through this minerals deal rather than, or through a loan, rather than being taxpayer assistance. That would be fine. But if it is giving up on sanctions, giving up on support for Ukraine altogether, that's actually rewarding Vladimir Putin for just stonewalling.
You work in a pretty sophisticated and complex business as a diplomat, Ambassador, and I can't imagine your thoughts when President Trump took to Truth Social with a message directly to Vladimir Putin following the attacks last evening. At least 9 dead, 60 wounded, civilians targeted again in Kyiv. President Trump didn't like it. He said, bad timing, not necessary. Vladimir, stop! Exclamation point. What is Donald Trump learning about Vladimir Putin here in real time?
Well, I think whether it's learning or not, I think President Trump probably has a sense of Putin as a strong man who wants to fight. But what I think he is seeing here is that Putin is taking advantage of the status of negotiations, the pressure that the U.S. is putting on Ukraine in order to escalate his attacks and try to add to that pressure and get more concessions along the way, such as demilitarization, for example. So every time that Trump tries to offer something positive for Putin, Putin pockets that and then ups the ante again with more attacks. And I think that's what we're seeing. This is showing in frustration in President Trump's tweet.
Well, and certainly we know there's been a good deal of frustration about this whole process on the part of allies, American allies, NATO allies as well, one of which, of course, was at the White House today in the form of Norway. And Mark Rutte, I would note, also met with administration officials. When we consider the position it puts NATO in, if Russia is allowed to maintain any part of Ukrainian territory that it has illegally invaded, what will that mean for the wider alliance, for the countries that border it?
Yeah, well, as your earlier guest, Natalia, said, it sets a precedent that you can take territory by force and get to keep it. And many NATO countries were either occupied by the Soviet Union or had governments imposed on them by the Soviet Union. We're talking all of the Warsaw Pact, the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia. They would be very, very concerned if anyone agreed to recognize the legitimacy of Russia's occupation of parts of Ukraine, because Russia will immediately turn to them and say, well, we should have this piece of Estonia, we should have this piece of Lithuania, we need a land bridge that's going to connect Kaliningrad to Belarus and the rest of Russia, so we're just going to take these things and you have to accept it. That is going to cause a lot of concern in Europe.
Ambassador, it's great to have you back. Kurt Volker, former U.S. ambassador to NATO, with us on Balance of Power. We thank you. And we do have breaking news now coming from the White House, having gotten a sense that this might be on the way from the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. This is coming from South Korea and the U.S. agreeing in principle on a framework for trade talks. This is just crossing the terminal now. South Korea's trade ministry putting forth an emailed statement to say as much after Scott Bessent, as we mentioned earlier, talked about, quote, very successful trade talks following a meeting this morning, saying that an agreement of understanding with South Korea would be coming shortly. Now we're hearing from that very delegation now, the trade ministry, in an emailed statement saying that the U.S. and South Korea agree in principle on a framework, to be clear, for trade talks. That's short of a deal. But those at the White House have suggested that some of these initial conversations with countries like South Korea, possibly Japan, could unlock further talks with other countries. And we'll have more on this for you as we learn more. Short time after President Trump blasted China for rejecting the purchase of Boeing jets, the president today said his administration was talking with China on trade, despite Beijing denying any existence of negotiations. We'll get into it next with Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute for International Economics on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Your CHIPS Act is a horrible, horrible thing. We give hundreds of billions of dollars, and it doesn't mean a thing. They take our money and they don't spend it. All that meant to them, we're giving them no money. All that was important to them was they didn't want to pay the tariffs, so they came and they're building, and many other companies are coming. We don't have to give them money.
President Trump during his joint address to Congress back in March, where he criticized the CHIPS Act, the bipartisan law signed by his predecessor that included $52 billion in aid to revitalize the American semiconductor industry. And one of the intended biggest beneficiaries of that funding, Intl. which just today gave a disappointing forecast and earnings out after the bell. The stock is sinking more than 5% after hours. And joining us now with the latest is Bloomberg's Mike Shepard. So, Mike, Intl, obviously a company that has long been struggling. The CHIPS Act, of course, was one thing that was supposed to aid it, yet there's been struggles to get their hands on that promised money. Just walk us through this picture.
Well, the picture for Intl continues to be troubling, Kaylee, and it is a long-running situation. You know, for years we've seen chip making migrate out of the United States to Asia, to countries like Taiwan, where they were really able to build up a manufacturing base for advanced semiconductor production. And Intl, as part of its turnaround, had hoped to take some of that foundry and factory business back. The former CEO, Pat Gelsinger, had really tried over a 3-year period to push that plan through. It was his vision for making the company. But even with support from the Biden administration, even with that shot in the arm from the CHIPS Act, it still wasn't enough. They struggled to get enough customers to sustain the kinds of investments that they're making right now in plants. We saw that Ohio factory that they had planned. It would have been one of the biggest semiconductor plants in the world. They have put off plans to finish work on that for several years until past 2030. So for the company right now, under its new CEO, Lip Bhutan, they are really trying to take yet another step in a different direction. One of the things that they're trying to do is cut down their operating expenses. They've announced plans to streamline some of the management. We've scooped earlier in the week that it would be a cut of as much as 20%. They didn't specify numbers today in their statement, but we are looking to see exactly how much they will do on that front.
We saw Pat Gelsinger repeatedly at the White House at events with Joe Biden trying to put forth this idea of reshoring the nation's chip industry. Did the administration simply pick the wrong company?
Well, and that's a question that people began to raise increasingly about whether the money was really well spent and well gambled on Intl, just given its issues and given the fact that even Gelsinger acknowledged himself that they had lost a little bit of their way when it comes to the engineering and ingenuity spirit that drove the company in its earlier days. Now, they don't have too many other options when it comes to American flag chip makers of that port or scale. So, when you think about it, the next big recipients were foreign companies like TSMC from Taiwan and Samsung Electronics from Korea.
Yeah, Mike, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Mike Shepard with us live in Washington. Thank you. The Trump administration's trade policies could be impacting individual states disproportionately hit lower-income Americans. And we're going to discuss that and a lot more when the governor of Mississippi, Tate Reeves, joins us. That's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio alongside Kaylee Lines. I'm Joe Matthew. Thanks for joining us live from Washington with news coming from South Korea following a meeting this morning and trade talks that were focused on, of course, day in and day out. Kaylee, we got a little bit of a tease from the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent on this earlier today, suggesting that meetings went well. And we now have the idea of a framework being put forth by the South Koreans. Just another brick in the wall as we move closer to some clarity on tariffs. But there are still so many questions when it comes to many industries, including energy.
Yeah, and on that note, today, Bloomberg's Alix spoke with the Secretary of Energy, Chris Wright, about tariffs, also about coal. Here's part of that conversation.
Coal has politically fallen out of favor. And again, to me, it's part of too much politics and energy. Coal has been the largest source of global electricity for 100 years, and it will be for decades more. That's just reality. In the United States, coal has been outcompeted by natural gas, and it went from over 50% of electricity. Today, it's in the teens. But that's market forces and competition. Coal is still critical to the American electricity grid. If you shut down all the coal plants today, electricity prices would skyrocket, our grid would destabilize. With modern technology, with scrubbers and pollution control devices, coal is a great source of electricity, and you store it on location. Security and energy requires diversity.
So do you think that coal in the teens right now, that could grow in terms of the energy mix in the U.S., or is it not going to go away?
It's probably not going to grow market share because the economics aren't there to build new coal plants. But the critical thing is to stop closing our existing coal plants. You said the hyperscalers, they weren't sure they wanted to power their things with coal. Everything they do today is powered by coal.
What about
coal's a sixth of our electricity grid. Every time you turn on your lights, you run your server, they run their businesses. They're powered by coal today.
But the new stuff will come from different things, like maybe nuclear or gas or wind and solar rather than coal.
The demand for the whole grid is, I think that's what the marketplace is telling us today. The fastest growing source of electricity in the United States by far has been natural gas. Natural gas was not a meaningful part of the electricity sector before. It's well over 40% of U.S. electricity today and growing. Natural gas probably hits 50% of U.S. electricity in the next bunch of years. But that's not politics. That's just math. That's just economics.
We're here at the Harold Hamm Institute to really get a sense of energy independence plus AI and how the power we have here can really power the evolution of AI. Do tariffs and uncertainty that we see on the macro sense mess that up?
I think what you're seeing, the uncertainty around tariffs, that's a short-term issue. President Trump's got two agendas. One is we've been very welcoming to imports. He wants to get all the other countries to be very welcoming to exports from the United States and imports to their country. So he's pushing to try to get trade more in balance. It had just gotten so far out of balance. And he wants to reindustrialize our country, bring these energy-intensive industries that left the United States and went overseas. He wants to bring those back. And with AI, of course, we don't want to lose it in the first place. We want to keep it here. AI is just like steel or petrochemicals. It's just a very energy-intensive manufacturing industry, and most of that we shipped abroad over the last 25 years. President Trump is keen to bring back those industries. Tariffs will help with that, and fairer trade policies will help with that, and he wants to make sure AI stays here.
So you feel confident when talking to CEOs that they will continue their AI dominant search here versus elsewhere, despite the uncertainty?
The uncertainty is because we're in the middle of a negotiation. The uncertainty isn't going to last forever. That's a few more weeks.
Can I hold you to that, and then we get calm?
I think so. It won't be that long. It won't be that long.
You can find the whole interview with Energy Secretary Chris Wright online or on the terminal. And as we hear from the Energy Secretary on tariffs, we're hearing from other world leaders and officials and companies on tariffs as well. Just within the last few minutes, Joe, headlines crossing the Bloomberg terminal, one from Japan's finance minister saying that when he spoke to the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, he told him the tariffs are highly regrettable and urged the U.S. to rethink the tariff regime. Plus, Intl, which just reported after the bell, is on the earnings call right now. The CFO of Intl says that tariffs could increase chances of a recession.
Continuing a string of commentary from executives saying as much in this earnings reporting season. On the Japan front, it's interesting. Japan intends to push back as well against the U.S. efforts to create a trade bloc against China. So this may not be going as smoothly as hoped at the White House.
Which, of course, raises the question of what tariffs will be implemented and the economic impact at home. We're going to get into that next here on Balance of Power, as we'll be joined by the Republican governor of Mississippi, Tate Reeves. That's just ahead here on Bloomberg TV and radio.
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Alongside Kaylee Lines, I'm Joe Matthew. We're glad you're with us today on this program, the Thursday edition. From the higher price of groceries that could cause an uptick in food insecurity to potential job losses and more expensive services, the impact of the Trump administration's tariffs may be felt far and wide and disproportionately affect low-income households. Mississippi has ranked among the states with the highest poverty rate for years and could be hit hard by the policies emanating from the White House. Well, its governor says the state is stronger than ever. And joining us now for more is that governor, Tate Reeves of Mississippi. Governor, thank you for being with us at the table today on Balance of Power. It's good to see you in Washington. Thank you. We last spoke in Milwaukee at the RNC, and you told us at the time when we asked you that tariffs would help to bring jobs to Mississippi. Our current reality, though, says prices will likely rise before that happens. Can Mississippi afford it?
Well, we're certainly, there are a lot of different opinions about the president's policies on tariffs, but I will just tell you what our experience has been. You know, Mississippi is a state where we make stuff. We build ships. we make automobiles. And we have had some tremendous successes in the last 5 years with over $32 billion in announcements for new capital investments. And what I would tell you is the last couple of months, we have a larger deal flow than at any time in our state's history. Over $70 billion in potential new projects looking at Mississippi, looking at the Southeast. And we're certainly not going to win all of those projects. But I do think when all is said and done, we are going to be a net winner here, and we're going to be a big net winner because we have invested in manufacturing, whereas many other states across the country gave up. We never gave up on manufacturing. We trained our people, and we're ready for this economic boom of onshoring.
Well, and you allude to the auto manufacturing footprint specifically, but keeping in mind that there are tariffs on key parts of that chain, like steel and aluminum, the auto tariffs that are also in place more widely, parts tariffs that could kick in, are expected to kick in next week. What are you hearing from Mississippi's auto companies specifically about the toll that might take?
Well, we have a major steel manufacturing in our state as well. Steel Dynamics, they are in the process of spending $2.5 billion building aluminum dynamics. They employ combined about 2,000 Mississippians once fully operational. We've had great conversations with our automobile manufacturers. Not only do we have Toyota and Nissan, we also have PACCAR, and we have a new facility being built in Marshall County with a joint venture between Daimler Trucks and Buses and Cummins and PACCAR. And so it's a very important industry to our state, and I anticipate those industries growing in our state in the foreseeable future. And I think more and more of their suppliers will be moved back onshore, and that's the kind of conversations that we're having in general.
Okay, well, to that end, Nissan, which has a big plant in your state, had said back in January it was going to be pulling back in Mississippi and in Tennessee. It has since turned course on those plans in light of the tariffs, in fact, restoring some manufacturing in Tennessee. Will you as a state try to appeal for the restoration of production in Canton, Mississippi, or do you see that already coming?
Well, approximately 6,000 Mississippians are employed under roof in Canton, Mississippi with Nissan. It is an incredibly important employer in our state. And look, here's what's happened in the automobile industry, and it's not unique to foreign manufacturers. It's true of our domestic manufacturers as well. The Biden administration tried to disrupt the marketplace by putting incentives in place for EVs, and the reality is the demand never caught up with the potential supply. And the fact is, Mississippians in general, but Americans, we're going to see more EVs built, and we're going to see that market share grow, but we're not going to go from 6% to 50%, which is what the Biden administration tried to manufacture by providing incentives and other things for these cars to do that. It's just not going to happen because the demand is not there.
We've talked, Governor, about one part of the president's economic plan, which is tariffs, but the White House contends this is only part one of this wider strategy with tax cuts coming later. And we understand, as part of the effort to get the tax cuts the president wants, that it's going to come with some pretty substantial spending cuts that Congress is going to start working their way through, including potentially cuts to Medicaid. And I wonder, as a governor of a state in which almost a quarter of your population are Medicaid or CHIP recipients, if you're concerned about the prospect of those cuts potentially materializing.
Well, I'm a strong proponent of spending cuts in Washington, D.C. Let's put this in context. The federal government is going to collect $5 trillion in revenues from Americans in this fiscal year. In the year that I became governor, the United States Treasury spent $4.4 trillion. But this year, they're going to spend $7 trillion. Washington, D.C. has a spending problem, and it is imperative that if we're going to get control of our national debt, which I would argue is a national security issue in and of itself, if we're going to get control of our national debt, if we're going to get control of our deficit, it is going to require spending cuts.
But in Medicaid specifically?
I think in Medicaid and other programs as well. Let's talk about Medicaid for just a second. Right now, in the state of Mississippi, the federal government pays 76% of every dollar that is spent on Medicaid, and we chose not to expand under the Affordable Care Act. So we did not have Obamacare expansion in Mississippi. But the federal government, if we had, and in every other state, pays 90% of Medicaid expenses for that expansion population. That expansion population primarily consists of able-bodied adults between the ages of 18 and 65 that could work but are choosing not to. And so it really, I don't understand under any scenario where it makes sense for you to take the traditional Medicaid population, which are single moms that are struggling to get by, and pay a much smaller percentage of the freight from the federal government than on able-bodied adults. It was put in place in 2010 to get the votes to pass the ACA in Congress. It makes no sense for Washington to continue to pay 90% of every dollar spent on that expansion population. I think that's where the Congress should look to find savings. If states want to keep those able-bodied adults that should be in the workforce on Medicaid, that's a decision that the states should make. It should not be incentivized to the tune of literally hundreds of billions of dollars, and that's what's happening right now. Mississippi and 9 other states chose not to expand. We think that helps drive people into the workforce. We think people having jobs not only provides for their family, but it provides dignity for the individual. We think work is important. That's the reason we eliminated our tax on work recently.
I want to get back to where we started with the idea of attracting business to your state. You've declared April as Confederate Heritage Month in Mississippi. And I want to be careful here asking this to you, but as a state with one of the largest black communities in the United States of America, how do you attract new business when you're embracing revisionist history?
Well, you don't have to be careful asking me any question. I will tell you I'm happy to answer any question that you have. We have the state of Mississippi, dating back to the early 1990s, Republican and Democrat governors alike have signed a resolution expressing Confederate Heritage Month in the month of April, just like we celebrate African American History Month in February. The reality is that Mississippi has a very complicated past, and we recognize that. But we're not trying to hide from it. We talk about it, and we're focused on what's best in the future, not what happened in the past. But we want to learn from those mistakes of the past, and we think that's part of it.
Governor, we appreciate your time. Joining us here in our Washington, D.C. studio, the governor of Mississippi, Tate Reeves. Now, a short time after President Trump blasted China for rejecting the purchase of Boeing jets, the president said his administration was talking with China on trade, despite Beijing denying the existence of any such deal negotiations. We'll get into that next with Mary Lovely of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, straight ahead on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Well, they had a meeting this morning, so I can't tell you. It doesn't matter who they is. We may reveal it later, but they had meetings this morning, and we've been meeting with China. And so I think you have, Jeff, as usual, I think you have your reporting wrong.
President Trump earlier today sharing they held a trade meeting with China this morning, but stopping short of saying who they are. This as Beijing denies that there have been any talks between the two countries regarding a trade deal, demanding now the U.S. revoke all unilateral tariffs. Joining us with more, Mary Lovely, Senior Fellow, Peterson Institute for International Economics. Mary, welcome back. Does it matter who they are?
It's become a little bit of a war of words, Joe. And I think that there is now, we've gone so far down this road that the optics, the words that are used, how U.S. approaches to China and its leadership has become an issue.
Well, when we consider the Chinese leadership, do you get the sense, Mary, that President Trump thought it was going to be a little bit easier to get Beijing to blink than it has proved to be, at least to this point?
It does seem that he thought it was going to be easier, although, as we've been arguing, the facts on the ground would have suggested that this was not going to be a cakewalk in any case. We've outlined ways in which the U.S. is still very dependent on China, how such an abrupt departure or decoupling from China would hurt American businesses, American consumers. So looking at the economic facts on the ground, it's really not that surprising that this has turned out to be quite a slog.
Well, even as we're having this conversation, a lot of investors are rotating money from U.S. markets to China investments. Is that a smart move? I guess it's a question of how long this is going to go on for.
Yeah, I'm not an investment expert, and I wouldn't give investment advice. But I think the administration has come to the realization that the tariffs, as we have announced, of over 100%, 145 in some cases, are simply not sustainable, as Secretary Besant has said. A better word might be vitally disruptive, vitally because they would hit vital industries hard. So I think that we're seeing that happening, and investors are responding to what they're seeing happening on the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Well, what we've seen crossing the Bloomberg in just the last hour, Mary, are some updates on trade talks from other Asian countries with the U.S., Japan and South Korea, both talking about the progress that is being made. And our understanding is, at least it's part of these conversations, the U.S. is asking these countries to consider their own relationships with China. And I wonder, for other Asian nations, what is a scarier proposition, the threat of higher tariffs from the United States or the threat of retaliation from Beijing if they make a trade deal that disadvantages them?
Well, as we've been traveling through Asia, the Asian officials are saying, we hope the U.S. doesn't do this, that the U.S. doesn't make us choose. And I think you'll find varying responses. But there's a limit to how much nations that are living in China's backyard are going to be able to do this. They're between a rock and a hard place. And if the U.S. is looking like a more and more unreliable party, not just on economic issues, but on security issues, they're watching what's happening in Ukraine. It's going to be hard to get them on side.
Interesting to hear from Scott Bessent on this just yesterday, Mary, suggesting it could take 2 to 3 years to arrive at a real trade deal, something with meaning with China. The president, though, says he could announce new tariff rates in the next 2 to 3 weeks. Which one do you think is more likely?
Well, I think that they'll settle for so-called frameworks, not real deals. A real trade agreement has to go through Congress. It has to be legislated. It has to be something that businesses can rely on being there when they need it. We've already seen that with President Trump, he's thrown certain parts of the USMCA under the bus, even though he negotiated this, rewrite of NAFTA himself. So it's businesses are not going to really respond quickly to these frameworks, but they are something that could potentially be hammered out in 2 weeks. They won't be deep. Each side can just not fulfill the promises, but nevertheless, we may get something.
When you say, Mary, that businesses won't respond, are you suggesting that they still may be holding back on making investment decisions, hiring decisions with a lack of clarity, even if technically some kind of progress is made within the 90-day window, the suggestion that it's not final?
Oh, yeah, I think the number one word we hear here is, in talking to, corporate leaders, is the word uncertainty. We've been trying to model these tariffs here at the Peterson Institute, and I can tell you they change by the day. And we're asking simple questions like, does this stack on top of something else? So you can imagine what's happening in boardrooms as they're trying to decide where to invest. This is a very, very complex and uncertain time. In making investments right now, I think for many people, the best answer is just wait it out, see where this is going to fall. Potentially looking at Liberation Day tariffs, we had potentially a massive rearrangement of supply chains. So there's a lot at stake here.
Yeah, and we're getting a taste of that uncertainty in the commentary from executives on these corporate earnings calls as they roll out. Mary Lovely, Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, thank you for joining us. The president's approval rating, meantime, sat at above 51% when he was inaugurated, and today we learned how far that rating has fallen, where Trump's approval sits now, his reaction to that number, and more when we assemble our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
The country's basically going through a colonic. I mean, this is one huge digestive exercise where we got to flush a lot of things through our system, and we got to figure out, right? Can you survive hard right, and that's it? Can you survive hard left, and that's it? I don't think so. I think most people are actually massively in the middle. It's a radical movement of common sense.
John Hope Bryant, CEO of Operation Hope, today on the early edition of Balance of Power, sharing his thoughts on the American electorate. And this comes as a new Fox News poll shows Americans' approval of President Trump is falling, standing now at only 44% as he rounds out his first 100 days in office. And joining us with their reaction to these figures is this evening's political panel, Christy Setzer, president and founder of New Heights Communications and Democratic strategist, alongside Republican strategist Sherrod Chamberlain, president and CEO of the Republican Main Street Partnership. Welcome to you both. Obviously, there's a question here as to how much an approval rating matters when you are a lame duck, you can't run for re-election. But how much does approval of the president and his economic policies specifically, Sarah, matter for all of those who do have to stand for re-election next year?
Well, it does matter, but they're not surprised. I mean, the country's very divided. So he'll be between 44 and probably 48 for probably most of his term. He certainly was the last time he was the president, and he certainly won again. So the members aren't that concerned about polling. And we really don't even pay that much attention to polling anymore at Republican Main Street Partnership.
It does seem that the president is. He went on Truth Social and called on Rupert Murdoch to fire his pollster. Does that mean that we're getting close to something true here?
I do think he's spooked. And I think he's seeing that not just from the poll numbers, which have been dropping. Again, and it's not just his overall approval that has dropped pretty precipitously, but it is also on every issue, including and especially the ones that people elected him on, which are the economy, where he's now, 15 or 20 points underwater in some polls, and even immigration, where now he's either even or, there's been polls that show him just slightly underwater on that as well. So he's losing on the merits, right? He is losing because people are seeing what his policies are and what they have meant. And in this very short period of time, less than, just about 3 months, he's lost them. He's lost even the people that voted for him.
Well, when we consider those policies, though, we've been talking here at Bloomberg for the last 24, 48 hours, Sarah, about how there does seem to be a tone change on the subject of tariffs, even on the chair of the Federal Reserve. Do the members of the Main Street Partnership breathe a sigh of relief when they kind of see the reversals we've been seeing?
They certainly do. I mean, they were very pleased when he rolled back to 90 days. We've always said we really need to give him 60 days to figure this out. He's working on it. We do think there are a lot of behind-the-scenes discussions going on with China. We're not overly concerned yet. We're certainly happy to see the market back up the last couple days. But we're going to give him still a little bit more time to work this out, because once he does, we feel the economy would just explode.
You're getting reports from town hall meetings from your members, I'm sure, and we know that Medicaid is an issue. The potential for cuts comes up at a lot of these. We just talked to Governor Tate Reeves about it, the potential impact that it could have on states, particularly with lower-income residents. Do you have any assurances from the White House that this, in fact, will not be touched as part of this negotiation, or are we accepting that it will be?
It's not going to be cut. We have the insurances from the White House, and we actually have insurances from the Speaker of the House. The Speaker's district has a lot of people that are on Medicaid, Medicare. He is not going to cut that, because it's like cutting his own throat. I mean, you don't do that if you're a politician. You don't hurt your home people. He wants to stay Speaker. In order to stay Speaker, you cannot cut Medicaid, Medicare.
Well, but then it becomes a question of the math. Where do you find the cuts then? But is anything as potent for Democrats, if they want to be able to wield a weapon against Republicans, than the Medicaid issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that Democrats have been talking about this all along, which is potential cuts to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. These are things that they know always have incredibly high approval ratings across the board, across party, et cetera. And in a lot of ways, up until this point, Democrats have sort of won elections by being able to wield the threat that Republicans are going to make these cuts. And then typically people sort of vote, and say, no, that's not what we want, and they vote for Democrats. At this point, a lot of other things that we have threatened for a long time have actually come to fruition. And so I think people would be very justified in worrying about, are those cuts actually going to happen this time, too?
Just to get into the procedure and the timeline here, Sarah, we always ask you for your crystal ball. There was an effort, at least a hope, to get this done in terms of reconciliation, extending the Trump tax cuts by Memorial Day. Most people don't see that happening. What's real?
End of July.
End of July?
Yeah. Before the August brace.
Does it include a debt ceiling agreement? Or will that be done separately?
I think
that may not be
that's
decided
a tough
yet.
one. That may not be. I'm not sure yet where that's going to come down, to be honest.
Yeah.
I don't want to make a prediction and be wrong. There's a lot of discussions as to where you put that in.
And of course, we don't have an ex date yet.
Yeah, and if it's separated out, Christy, with just a minute left here, can Democratic votes be relied on to lift the debt ceiling?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure that I want to put my cards on the table here. I'm not sure.
Wow.
All right.
We got non-answers on two big questions. We got to the soft spot
this evening, I
Absolutely. Fascinating. Christy Setzer and Sarah Chamberlain, thank you for the great conversation and analysis on Balance of Power.
And of course, for more analysis, you can always check out the Washington edition newsletter on the terminal and online. I would guess next week it will be a lot about reconciliation. This week it's a lot about tariffs, but of course also the ongoing war in Ukraine. Lawmakers are just days away. It's going to get crowded around here soon. Thanks for joining us on Balance of Power. We'll do this all over again with a lot more to report from Washington tomorrow on Bloomberg TV and radio.